My sister told me Dad cheated, so I wouldn't let him walk me down the aisle. She got exactly what liars deserve. Nothing. My dad and I were inseparable growing up. He taught me how to ride a bike, went to every dance recital, and stayed up helping me with calculus homework even though he hadn't done math in 20 years. When other girls complained about their fathers missing important events, I never related because my dad never missed anything. My older sister Haley was different. She always wanted Mom's attention and got jealous whenever Dad and I did anything together. She'd throw fits when he came to my softball games instead of her drama club and complained that I was his favorite even though he bent over backwards trying to include her in everything. When I got engaged, the first thing I did was ask Dad to walk me down the aisle. He cried and said it would be the greatest honor of his life. Haley rolled her eyes and muttered something about it being typical. 3 months before my wedding, Haley called me crying. She said she had to tell me something about Dad that would change everything. She claimed she saw Dad at a hotel with another woman 6 months ago. She said they were kissing in the lobby and she followed them to a room. She had details about what the woman looked like, what she was wearing, even the room number. She said she didn't want to ruin my wedding but couldn't let me have Dad walk me down the aisle knowing what he did to Mom. I was destroyed. When I confronted Dad, he looked completely shocked and denied everything. He said he'd never cheat on Mom and couldn't believe I'd think he would. But Haley had so many specifics and she was crying so hard when she told me. Why would she lie about something like that? I told Dad I needed space to think. He kept calling and texting, but I ignored him. I told Mom I wanted to walk myself down the aisle because I was independent. Mom thought it was weird but didn't push. Haley immediately volunteered to walk with me instead, saying sisters should support each other. The wedding planning continued, but Dad was basically excluded from everything. He'd show up to vendor meetings and I'd leave. He'd text asking about my dress appointment and I wouldn't respond. Haley was right there for everything, though, taking the father-daughter dance song suggestions, helping with the ceremony planning, even giving opinions on the menu tasting that was supposed to be for parents. She kept saying how proud she was of me for being so strong and not letting a cheater give me away. 2 weeks before the wedding, I ran into my dad's coworker at the grocery store. She mentioned how sad Dad was about missing my wedding planning and then said something that made my blood run cold. She asked if I'd ever thanked Dad for the birthday surprise he planned for Mom at that hotel 6 months ago. The one where he rented out the entire restaurant and had all of Mom's friends flown in. The same date Haley said she saw him cheating. I drove straight to my parents' house and asked Mom about her birthday. She lit up talking about how Dad surprised her with a weekend at a fancy hotel and had her college roommate fly in from Oregon. She showed me pictures from that exact day, at that exact hotel, with the woman Haley described. It was Mom's friend Linda, who I'd met dozens of times. They weren't kissing in the lobby, they were hugging because Linda hadn't seen Mom in 5 years. The room number Haley gave? It was the suite Dad rented for the party. I called Haley immediately and asked her why she lied. She broke down and admitted she made it up because she was tired of me and Dad having such a perfect relationship. She said it wasn't fair that I got to be Daddy's little girl when she was the oldest. She wanted just once for me to feel like she did, left out and unimportant. She thought if I was mad at Dad during the wedding, she could step in and be the important one for once. She actually said I should thank her for showing me I didn't need Dad. I hung up and called my dad sobbing. He just said he knew I'd figure out the truth eventually, and that he loved me no matter what. We fixed everything for the wedding, but I didn't tell anyone else what really happened. Haley showed up to the wedding expecting to be part of the processional. Instead, she found out she'd been moved to the back row with the distant relatives. When the music started, Dad walked me down the aisle just like we'd always planned. During the father-daughter dance, Dad announced that he was so proud of the woman I'd become and that he was updating his will to make sure I knew how much I meant to him. He said character and loyalty mattered more than birth order. Haley left immediately after that. The next week, Dad's lawyer sent out copies of the new will. I woke up in the hotel suite with sunlight cutting through the curtains. Lucian's arm was wrapped around me, and I could feel his steady breathing against my neck. The wedding was over. Dad had walked me down the aisle. Haley had left in shame. Everything should have felt perfect, but instead I just felt tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. My sister had tried to destroy my relationship with Dad because she was jealous. She'd made up an entire story about him cheating with enough details to make it believable. She'd watched me suffer for months while she positioned herself as my support system. Lucian stirred and pulled me closer. He asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't sure. Our family would never be the same after this. Mom didn't even know the full truth yet about what Haley had done. I kept replaying the moment when Haley admitted she'd lied. The way she said I should thank her for showing me I didn't need Dad. Like she'd done me some kind of favor by almost ruining the most important relationship in my life. Lucian got up to order room service and I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Dad. 2 texts from Mom asking if we wanted to come over for breakfast. Nothing from Haley. I put the phone face down on the nightstand. Around noon, Dad called again. I answered, and his voice sounded rough, like he'd been crying. He told me Haley had left him a voicemail overnight. She'd been crying and trying to apologize, but the words didn't make sense. She kept saying she was sorry and that she didn't mean for things to go this far. Dad said he listened to it 3 times, trying to understand how his daughter could do something like this. He told me what Haley did wasn't just lying. It was planned. She'd thought about it and decided that hurting him through me was worth it if it meant she got to feel important. He said he wasn't ready to talk to her yet. Maybe not for a long time. I told him I needed time too, and he said he understood. He asked if I was happy with how the wedding turned out, and I said yes. The parts that mattered were perfect. He told me he loved me and hung up. An hour later, Mom called. Her voice was different, tight and confused. She said Haley had shown up at their house at 7 in the morning, demanding to know what was in the new will. Mom had told her to leave, but Haley started yelling about how unfair it was that Dad changed everything just because I was his favorite. Mom asked what she was talking about. That's when it all came out. Haley broke down and admitted she'd lied about Dad cheating. She told Mom the whole story while standing in the driveway. How she'd made up the details about the hotel. How she'd used Mom's birthday party as the basis for her lie. How she'd spent months positioning herself to take Dad's place in my wedding. Mom said she couldn't believe it. She kept asking me if it was true, and I told her yes. Everything Haley said was a lie. Mom went quiet for a long time. Then she said she didn't know her own daughter. She asked how someone could be that jealous, that calculating. I didn't have an answer. Mom said she needed to go and hung up. 3 days later, Lucian and I got back from our mini honeymoon. We'd gone to a cabin upstate where there was no cell service. It was nice to be disconnected for a while. When we walked into our apartment, my phone started buzzing. 17 missed calls from Haley. I sat on the couch and opened my email. There was a long message from her with the subject line, "Please read this." She said she'd been going through a hard time, that she made a mistake. She wrote about how she'd always felt like the leftover daughter. How Dad's relationship with me made her feel invisible. She said she knew what she did was wrong, but she hoped I could understand where she was coming from. The whole email was about her feelings, her pain, her embarrassment at the wedding. There was nothing about what she'd actually done to me or Dad, no real acknowledgement of the manipulation. Just vague words about the situation and how she wished things had gone differently. Like it was all some accident instead of a choice she'd made over and over for months. I deleted the email without responding. The next evening, Maya came over with 2 bottles of wine. She hugged me at the door and said she'd been dying to talk about what happened. We sat on the couch and she poured us both a glass. She asked what I was going to do about Haley. The whole wedding party had seen the drama. They'd watched Haley leave after Dad's announcement. They'd asked Maya what happened and she didn't know what to tell them. I admitted I had no idea how to move forward. Haley had been willing to destroy my relationship with Dad just so she could feel important for once. Maya took a sip of wine and said something that made me stop. She pointed out this probably wasn't the first time Haley had manipulated situations. It was just the first time she got caught. I thought about all the times growing up when Haley had created drama. The times she'd told Mom that Dad promised to come to her drama club, but he swore he'd said no such thing. The times she'd gotten upset about plans that somehow always fell through. I'd always explained it away as normal sister stuff. But maybe Maya was right. Maybe I'd been seeing the pattern my whole life and just didn't want to believe it. A few days later, Dad's lawyer Fernanda called. She said she needed to schedule a meeting to go over the will changes. Then she mentioned that Haley had contacted her office trying to get information about the new terms. Fernanda had shut that down immediately. She reminded me that Dad had every right to distribute his assets based on character and trustworthiness. She said she'd seen families torn apart by money, and this wasn't about money. This was about Dad making it clear what values mattered to him. I thanked her and we scheduled a meeting for the following week. After I hung up, I felt both supported and sad. It shouldn't have come to this. Haley shouldn't have forced Dad to make such a public statement about her character. But she had, and now we all had to live with the consequences. 2 weeks after the wedding, Mom called and invited Lucian and me to dinner. When we got there, she made Dad's favorite pot roast. We sat at the table and made small talk about work and the honeymoon. Then Mom brought up Haley. She asked if I'd be willing to sit down with her and a family therapist. She said Haley was her daughter too, and she couldn't just cut her off. I understood where Mom was coming from, but I was hesitant. All of Haley's messages had been about her pain, her embarrassment, her hard time. There was no genuine remorse, just excuses. But Mom looked so heartbroken sitting there. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying before we arrived. I told her I'd think about it. Lucian squeezed my hand under the table. Dad didn't say anything, but I could see the tension in his jaw. The care package arrived on a Thursday. I found it outside our apartment door with my name written in Haley's handwriting. Inside were bags of my favorite snacks, the chocolate-covered pretzels I always bought at the movies, the spicy chips I ate during finals week in college. There was a card that said, "I miss my sister," with a drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands. I opened the card and read her message. She wrote about how she wished we could go back to being close, how she remembered all the good times we had. She said she was sorry about the situation and hoped we could move past the misunderstandings. I read it 3 times looking for a real apology, looking for her to name what she'd actually done. But there was nothing. Just vague words about situations and misunderstandings, like she'd accidentally spilled coffee on me instead of deliberately trying to ruin my life. I threw the whole package in the trash. Lucian found me in the kitchen with tears running down my face. He didn't say anything. He just held me while I cried. I started seeing a therapist the next week. Her office was in a building downtown with plants in every corner. She asked me why I was there, and I told her about Haley, about the lies and the manipulation. But then I started talking about other things. Times in our childhood when Haley had twisted situations. Times when she'd made me feel guilty for spending time with Dad. Times when she'd created drama right before important events. The therapist listened and took notes. She said jealousy this intense doesn't develop overnight. She asked if I'd ever noticed patterns before. I admitted I had, but I'd always explained them away as normal sister rivalry. She said I was probably just now seeing things clearly for the first time. That sometimes we don't want to believe the people we love are capable of hurting us on purpose. So we make excuses. We tell ourselves stories that make their behavior seem less intentional. But Haley's behavior had been intentional. She'd planned it. She'd executed it. She'd watched me suffer and felt good about it. Dad and I met for lunch at the diner where he used to take me after softball games. We sat in our usual booth and ordered burgers. He told me he'd been seeing a therapist too. He said he needed help working through the hurt of having his daughter accuse him of something so terrible, of having me believe it even for a little while. He said he understood why I did. Haley had been convincing, but it still hurt. He admitted that Haley's jealousy had been obvious since we were kids. He'd tried so hard to include her in everything, to make her feel special. But nothing was ever enough. She always wanted what I had instead of appreciating what she had. He never imagined she'd go this far, though, that she'd try to hurt him by destroying his relationship with me. We both cried a little sitting there in the booth, but we also laughed about good memories. The time he taught me to ride a bike and I crashed into the mailbox. The dance recital where I forgot the choreography and just spun in circles. The calculus homework sessions where we both got so frustrated we started making up silly word problems. Our relationship had survived Haley's manipulation. That was what mattered. We paid the check and he hugged me in the parking lot. He said he was proud of the woman I'd become, that I'd figured out the truth and made things right. I told him I loved him and got in my car. Mom called 3 days after my lunch with Dad. She sounded tired but also hopeful in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. She said Haley had contacted her asking for recommendations for therapists. Not family therapists for all of us together, but individual therapists just for her. Mom said Haley admitted she needed to work on herself before she could even think about fixing things with the family. I sat down on the couch while Mom talked. This felt different from Haley's previous attempts at apologies. Those had all been about making herself feel better, or getting back into everyone's good graces as quickly as possible. This sounded like she might actually be taking responsibility. Mom asked if I'd be willing to try family therapy eventually. I told her I needed to see real change from Haley first. Not just words or promises, but actual different behavior over time. Mom understood. She said she'd been reading about manipulation and jealousy, trying to understand how Haley could have done something so calculated. She admitted she'd made excuses for Haley's behavior for years, always telling herself it was just normal sister rivalry. But normal sisters don't fabricate cheating accusations to destroy their father's most important relationship. I promised Mom I'd keep an open mind about therapy down the road. But I also told her I wouldn't pretend everything was fine just to make family gatherings less awkward. If Haley wanted to be part of my life again, she'd have to earn it. A month after the wedding, Lucian and I decided to host a small dinner party at our apartment. We invited my parents, Maya, and a few close friends. Dad asked if he could bring his coworker Kurt. I immediately said yes. Kurt was the one whose random comment at the grocery store had exposed Haley's entire lie. Without him mentioning the birthday surprise, I might have gone through with excluding Dad from the wedding. The night of the dinner, everyone arrived within 15 minutes of each other. Kurt showed up with a bottle of wine and a nervous smile. He pulled me aside in the kitchen while Lucian was greeting the other guests. He said he'd been worried about reaching out after everything went down because he didn't want to seem like he was inserting himself into family drama. I hugged him and told him he'd saved my relationship with Dad. During dinner, the conversation naturally turned to the wedding. Maya brought up how shocked everyone had been when Haley left so abruptly after Dad's speech. Kurt laughed and said he had no idea his casual comment about the hotel would lead to such a dramatic chain of events. He'd just been making conversation at the grocery store, trying to cheer me up because I'd looked so sad. Dad raised his glass and said sometimes the smallest moments change everything. We all clinked glasses and laughed, but there was sadness underneath the humor. The whole situation had been so unnecessary. Haley had created this elaborate lie that nearly destroyed multiple relationships. And for what? Because she was jealous? Because she wanted to feel important? After dinner, Dad and Kurt talked about work while Lucian and I cleaned up. Mom helped dry dishes and told me quietly that Haley had started seeing a therapist twice a week. She said Haley seemed genuinely committed to working through her issues. I nodded but didn't say much. I was glad Haley was in therapy, but I'd believe in real change when I saw it sustained over time. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed with a text from Haley. It was the first time she'd contacted me directly since the wedding. My stomach tightened when I saw her name on the screen. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won out. The message was long. She started by saying she knew I probably didn't want to hear from her. Then she wrote out specifically what she'd done wrong. She said she had deliberately manipulated me by fabricating a story about Dad cheating. She acknowledged that she'd given me specific details to make the lie more convincing. She admitted she'd watched me suffer and had felt good about taking Dad's place in the wedding planning. She wrote that she understood if I never forgave her. She said she wasn't asking for forgiveness or trying to get back into my life. She just wanted me to know she was working on herself in therapy and beginning to understand how toxic her jealousy had been. The message was different from her previous attempts. Those had all centered on her feelings, how embarrassed she was, how sorry she felt, how much she missed me. This message acknowledged the harm she'd caused without making it about her pain. I read it 3 times. Part of me wanted to delete it and block her number, but another part of me felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly. More like a tiny crack in the wall of anger I'd built around her. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to think. 3 days later, I finally texted Haley back. I kept it short. I told her I appreciated that she'd acknowledged what she did wrong and that she'd been specific about the manipulation. I said I needed more time before I was ready to talk in person or have any kind of relationship with her. I explained that trust takes a long time to rebuild, and I wasn't going to rush the process just to make everyone comfortable. Her response came back within minutes. She said she understood completely. She said she wouldn't push for more contact or try to force reconciliation. She thanked me for responding at all and said she'd respect whatever boundaries I needed. I showed the exchange to Lucian that night. He read through the messages carefully. Then he said maybe therapy was actually helping her understand boundaries. The old Haley would have called immediately after my text, crying and demanding to talk things through right away. The old Haley would have shown up at our apartment or enlisted Mom to pressure me into forgiving her faster. This version was giving me space. It was a small thing, but it mattered. 2 months after the wedding, Mom organized a family dinner at her and Dad's house. She called to invite Lucian and me, and I asked if Haley would be there. Mom said no. She said she wanted to have a meal with just the 4 of us because it had been so long since we'd all relaxed together. I agreed immediately. We drove to my parents' house on a Saturday evening. Dad opened the door with a huge smile and hugged both of us. Mom had made her famous pot roast with all the sides I loved. We sat around the dining room table where I'd eaten thousands of meals growing up. The difference was obvious within the first 10 minutes. There was no tension. No one was walking on eggshells or monitoring their words to avoid setting someone off. Dad told funny stories about his coworkers. Mom talked about her book club. Lucian and I shared details about setting up our apartment. We laughed easily and often. At one point, I looked around the table and felt a wave of sadness mixed with relief. This was what family dinners could be like without Haley's jealousy poisoning everything. Dad seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. His shoulders weren't tight. He wasn't carefully measuring his attention to make sure no one felt left out. Mom was smiling genuinely instead of wearing the worried expression she usually had when trying to manage Haley's moods. It felt wonderful to enjoy my family without drama. But it also felt sad that peace required Haley's absence. After dinner, Dad and I did the dishes together like we used to. He asked how I was really doing with everything. I told him the truth. I was angry at Haley, but also grieving the sister relationship I'd thought we had. He nodded and said he understood. He admitted he was grieving too. Grieving the daughter he'd thought Haley was versus the person her actions had revealed her to be. Over the next few weeks, Haley sent me updates about her therapy progress. She didn't ask for responses. She didn't demand acknowledgement. She just sent brief messages every couple of weeks sharing what she was learning. Her therapist was helping her understand that jealousy had been her primary emotion for most of her life. She'd felt like she had to compete for attention and love, rather than understanding that Dad's love wasn't a limited resource. She wrote that this didn't excuse what she'd done. She said she was beginning to see a pattern in her behavior going back to childhood. Times when she'd created drama or manipulated situations to get attention. She admitted she was horrified looking back at some of the things she'd done over the years. I read each message but rarely responded. When I did reply, I kept it brief, usually just acknowledging that I'd received the message. Lucian asked me once if the updates bothered me. I told him they didn't. If anything, they made me feel like Haley might actually be doing real work instead of just performing remorse. The messages showed self-awareness and accountability without making me responsible for managing her feelings. 3 months after the wedding, I agreed to meet Haley for coffee. I chose a place downtown that was public and neutral. I told Lucian where I'd be and when to expect me home. I arrived 10 minutes early and picked a table near the window. Haley walked in exactly on time. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail and she wasn't wearing makeup. She saw me and walked over slowly. She asked if she could sit down. I nodded. We both ordered coffee from the server. Neither of us spoke while we waited for the drinks to arrive. When they did, Haley wrapped her hands around her mug and stared at it for a long moment. Then she started talking. She apologized in person, with tears running down her face. But she didn't make her tears my responsibility. She didn't reach for my hand or ask me to comfort her. She just cried while she spoke. She told me about her therapy sessions, about the journaling her therapist had assigned where she had to write about every time she remembered creating drama out of jealousy. She said looking at the list had made her sick. She'd manipulated situations and twisted facts more times than she could count. She'd blamed everyone else for her feelings instead of taking responsibility for her choices. She said the lie about Dad cheating was the worst thing she'd done, but it wasn't the only manipulative thing. It was just the one that finally had real consequences. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I took a sip of my coffee. Then I told her I appreciated the apology. I said I could see she was working on herself and that mattered. But I also told her trust doesn't come back quickly. She'd deliberately tried to destroy my relationship with Dad during one of the most important times of my life. That kind of betrayal doesn't heal in a few months of therapy. Haley nodded. She said she didn't expect me to trust her again quickly. She said she understood she'd destroyed something precious through her own actions. She wasn't asking to be in my life the same way as before. She just hoped that eventually, maybe we could rebuild something honest, even if it looked completely different from what we'd had. Her humility surprised me. The old Haley would have pushed for immediate forgiveness. She would have made promises about how different things would be, and expected me to accept them at face value. This version seemed to understand that words meant nothing without sustained changed behavior. I told her I was willing to try rebuilding a relationship, but it would take time. She thanked me, and we finished our coffee talking about neutral topics. When we left, she hugged me briefly. It felt awkward but not hostile. That evening, I called Dad and told him about the coffee meeting. He said Haley had been sending him similar updates about her therapy. He sounded cautiously hopeful, but also realistic. He said trust had to be earned back through consistent behavior over time, not just through words and therapy insights. Anyone could say the right things. The real test was whether Haley could maintain this growth long-term, or if she'd slip back into old patterns once the immediate consequences faded. We talked about moving forward slowly as a family. Dad said he wasn't ready to have Haley at family dinners yet. He needed more time to work through his own hurt. I told him I understood completely. We agreed to take things one step at a time and see if Haley could prove through her actions that she'd actually changed. 4 months after the wedding, Mom scheduled a family therapy session. She'd found a counselor who worked with families dealing with serious betrayals and manipulation. The appointment was on a Tuesday afternoon. Lucian offered to come with me for support, but I told him this was something I needed to do with just my immediate family. The therapist's office was in a building near the hospital. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and calming artwork on the walls. Mom and Dad arrived first. Then Haley came in a few minutes later. We all sat in the waiting room not talking until the therapist called us back. Her name was Dr. Smith. She had kind eyes and a calm presence. She asked us to sit wherever we felt comfortable. I sat between Mom and Dad. Haley sat across from us. Dr. Smith explained that this first session would focus on everyone sharing their perspective on what happened and how it affected them. She said the goal wasn't to fix everything today, but to start building a foundation for honest communication. Haley spoke first. She took full responsibility for fabricating the cheating story. She didn't deflect or make excuses. She explained that her jealousy had driven her to hurt the people she loved most. She said she understood why Dad had changed his will and that she deserved the consequences of her actions. Mom cried hearing Haley finally acknowledge the full extent of what she'd done. Dad remained quiet through most of the session, but he nodded when Haley talked about consequences. I shared how the betrayal had made me question every interaction we'd ever had, how I'd started seeing patterns of manipulation going back years. Dr. Smith listened carefully to everyone. Then she said healing from this kind of betrayal would take time and consistent effort. She said Haley's individual therapy was important, but the family also needed to learn new ways of communicating that didn't rely on old toxic patterns. We scheduled another session for 2 weeks later. When we left, Haley thanked everyone for coming. Dad put his hand on her shoulder briefly but didn't say anything. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. The following week, Dr. Smith scheduled our second family therapy session. This time the office felt less strange when we walked in. Mom sat in the middle between Dad and me. Haley took the same chair across from us. Dr. Smith started by asking how everyone processed the previous session. Haley spoke up right away and said she'd been thinking a lot about family roles and how we all got stuck in patterns that hurt everyone. She explained that her therapist was helping her see how the favorite child and problem child labels became toxic over years. Dr. Smith nodded and asked the rest of us to share our thoughts. I admitted that I'd been Dad's favorite and never questioned whether that dynamic was fair or healthy. Dad looked uncomfortable, but agreed that he'd contributed to the problem by not recognizing how his special bond with me made Haley feel we're excluded. Mom wiped her eyes and said she'd tried to balance things but ended up just managing the tension instead of addressing the real issues. Dr. Smith walked us through exercises about setting boundaries that didn't depend on competition or comparison. She explained that families function better when relationships aren't ranked and when love isn't treated like a limited resource. We practiced new ways of talking about our feelings without blaming or attacking. Haley did well with the exercises and didn't get defensive when Dad brought up specific examples of her past behavior. The session lasted 90 minutes and ended with homework assignments for everyone. Dr. Smith wanted us to practice direct communication and to notice when we fell back into old patterns. Over the next few weeks, Haley started reaching out to me in ways that felt different from before. She texted to ask how my job was going and actually remembered details I'd mentioned in previous conversations. She sent me an article about something I was interested in without making it about herself. When we talked on the phone, she asked about Lucian and our life together instead of immediately steering the conversation to her own problems. She shared things about her therapy journey but didn't make me responsible for fixing her or validating her progress. One afternoon, she called just to say she'd been thinking about a time we went to the beach as kids and how she'd ruined the day by throwing a fit when Dad helped me build a sandcastle. She said she was starting to see patterns she'd never recognized before, and it was hard but necessary work. The conversations felt awkward sometimes because we were learning how to relate without competition as the foundation. But the awkwardness felt more honest than the fake closeness we'd pretended to have before. She didn't ask about Dad constantly or try to get information about his feelings toward her. She focused on building something real with me that wasn't about winning his attention. 5 months after the wedding, Dad called and asked if he could stop by our apartment. Lucian was at work, so it was just the two of us sitting at our kitchen table with coffee. Dad looked thoughtful and a little nervous. He told me he'd been meeting with Fernanda to discuss the will again. He said Haley's consistent effort and genuine change over the past months had made him reconsider the distribution. I felt my stomach tighten because I didn't want to have this conversation. Dad explained that he wasn't rushing to fix everything just because Haley had been in therapy for a few months. He said character had to be proven through sustained behavior over time, not through crisis apologies or temporary good behavior. But he also said that completely cutting Haley out forever might not be fair if she was truly doing the work to change. I told him the will was his decision to make, and I appreciated that he wasn't just immediately rewarding Haley for doing what she should have been doing all along. We talked about trust and how it's built slowly through consistent actions. Dad said he wanted to see at least 6 months of sustained change before making any adjustments. He asked how I felt about potentially having a more balanced inheritance situation in the future. I told him honestly that I'd rather have a real relationship with my sister than his money, but I also didn't think Haley should be rewarded too quickly for basic decency. In late November, Lucian and I decided to host Thanksgiving dinner at our apartment. It would be the first major family gathering since the wedding. I called Mom and Dad to invite them, then took a deep breath and called Haley. She sounded surprised and asked if I was sure I wanted her there. I told her yes, but that I needed the day to go smoothly without drama. She promised she'd be on her best behavior and thanked me 3 times before we hung up. The days leading up to Thanksgiving made me anxious. Lucian helped me clean and cook and reminded me that we could ask anyone to leave if things got uncomfortable. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and sunny. Mom and Dad showed up first with pies and a bottle of wine. Haley arrived 20 minutes later with flowers and a nervous smile. The first hour was tense with everyone being overly polite and careful. We sat down to eat around 2 in the afternoon. The conversation stayed on safe topics like work and weather. Haley complimented the food and asked Lucian about his job without making it about herself. When Dad told a story about something funny that happened at work, Haley laughed genuinely instead of getting quiet and bitter like she used to. After dinner, Dad and Haley ended up in the kitchen together while the rest of us cleared the table. I watched them from the doorway as they talked quietly. Dad's posture was still guarded but not hostile. Haley nodded at something he said, and then they hugged carefully, like two people learning how to touch again after a long separation. Mom saw it too and wiped tears from her eyes. The hug only lasted a few seconds, but it felt significant. When everyone left that evening, I felt exhausted but cautiously hopeful. A week after Thanksgiving, my phone rang while I was getting ready for work. Haley's name appeared on the screen. She thanked me again for including her in the holiday, and said it meant more than I probably realized. Then she admitted something that surprised me. She said watching Dad and me be close during dinner had triggered her old jealousy response, but instead of acting on it or letting it ruin the day, she'd worked through the feelings in her therapy session that week. She explained how hard it was to sit with those emotions without lashing out or creating drama to get attention. She said she was proud of herself for handling it differently. I told her I was proud of her too and meant it. We talked for another 15 minutes about other things, just normal sister conversation that didn't revolve around competition or resentment. After we hung up, I realized it was the first time in years I'd told Haley I was proud of her and actually felt it in my chest instead of just saying empty words. 6 months after the wedding, Dad scheduled a meeting at his lawyer's office. He asked both Haley and me to come together. Fernanda greeted us in the conference room with folders and documents spread across the table. Dad sat at the head and waited until we were both settled before speaking. He explained that he'd decided to update his will again to create a more balanced distribution between Haley and me. He said Haley had demonstrated consistent change and genuine growth over 6 months, which showed him that her transformation wasn't just temporary crisis management. Dad looked at both of us carefully and said trust could be rebuilt through sustained effort and real commitment to change. Haley's eyes filled with tears. She thanked Dad and said she was just grateful to be part of the family again. She didn't ask about specific amounts or percentages. She didn't compare herself to me or complain that it took 6 months. She just accepted his decision with grace. Dad told us both that the new will reflected his belief in second chances, but also honored the reality of what had happened. I would still receive more because of the years of trust and loyalty, but Haley would no longer be completely excluded. Fernanda walked us through the paperwork and explained the details. When we left the office, Haley hugged me in the parking lot and whispered that she knew she didn't deserve this, but would spend the rest of her life proving Dad's faith in her wasn't misplaced. Over the following months, Haley and I started meeting for lunch every couple of weeks. We'd sit at different restaurants around town and talk about real things instead of surface-level small talk. Our relationship felt different, but healthier than it ever had before. We discussed our childhood honestly, including the ways we both contributed to toxic patterns, even though her betrayal was the thing that forced everything into the open. I admitted that I'd enjoyed being Dad's favorite and never thought about how that made her feel. She acknowledged that her jealousy had poisoned our relationship long before the wedding incident. One afternoon at a cafe near my office, Haley told me she was actually grateful the truth came out when it did. She said living with that lie would have destroyed her eventually, and the consequences forced her to face problems she'd been avoiding her whole life. We talked about Mom and how much happier she seemed now that the family dynamics were more balanced. We made plans for future holidays and discussed what healthy boundaries looked like going forward. The conversations weren't always easy, and sometimes we had to take breaks when emotions ran high. But we kept showing up and doing the work, which felt more valuable than any perfect relationship we'd pretended to have before. As Lucian and I celebrated our 6-month anniversary with dinner at the restaurant where we had our first date, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened since Haley's lie almost destroyed my family. The worst betrayal of my life had somehow led to the most honest relationships I'd ever had with the people I loved. Dad and I were still close, maybe even closer now because we'd survived something that could have permanently damaged us. But now Haley and I had something real too, built on accountability and truth instead of competition and resentment. Mom seemed lighter and happier with the family dynamics more balanced and healthy. I'd learned that sometimes the people who hurt you most can actually change if they're willing to do the genuinely hard work of looking at themselves and taking responsibility. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. The scar would always be there. But scars were proof that something healed and healing was possible even after the deepest cuts. Lucian reached across the table and took my hand, and I smiled knowing that my family might be complicated and imperfect, but at least now it was honest.